Greetings, science friends. Welcome to Mr. Del Prado's overview on photosynthesis and cell respiration. So what we'll do in this video is we'll take a look at a form of energy that is used by all living things, and we'll talk about how plants make usable energy for themselves, and then we'll also talk about how animals make usable energy for themselves. So, in order to be alive, you need to be able to take in energy. That is one of the characteristics of life. Remember that animals take in energy by eating food. That's where we get our glucose from. But plants, since most of them don't eat food, they need to get their energy from the sun, and they will actually make glucose using sunlight and carbon from the atmosphere to actually make C6H12O6, which is glucose, which can then be converted to ATP once it's in the mitochondria of either the plant cell or the animal cell. Okay, so plants are going to use sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, and look what they're going to end up making. They're going to end up making glucose, and then the waste product, the gas waste product, is going to be oxygen. If you look at cellular respiration, we're going to take glucose and oxygen, we're going to produce carbon dioxide, water, and the molecule ATP. And when I say we're going to do it, I do mean plants and animals, because remember, while plants photosynthesize to make their glucose, animals use cell respiration to take glucose, turn it into ATP. But plant cells also use the glucose that they've made to turn into ATP. So photosynthesis is the process of making glucose. Cellular respiration is the process of taking glucose and turning it into ATP. Here's a picture for all of our visual learners out there. You can see the sun shining down on the chloroplast, which is the organelle that is used for ATP, or used for glucose production inside the plant. That glucose will then go into the mitochondria, where it is then essentially used and ripped apart so that we can generate ATP for both plant cells and animal cells. Photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplast. Animal cells and plant cells will use the mitochondria for cell respiration. So how do cells end up using energy? Energy is essentially stored in chemical bonds, and when those bonds are broken, energy is given off. The ultimate molecule for energy in living things here on Earth is the molecule adenosine triphosphate. We won't have you memorize that word, but you should know that ATP is the molecule that is used to generate energy for both plants and animals. For those of you biochemists at home, it is the ripping off of the last phosphate off ATP that actually gives off energy, and that energy can then be used for a variety of cellular processes. This next slide's a good one. You should really know the difference between what is being produced in photosynthesis and what is being produced in cell respiration. The molecule being made in photosynthesis, the big molecule, is glucose. And then cellular respiration is going to take that glucose and essentially is going to turn it into ATP. You can see the overall reaction for photosynthesis in this slide. Plants are going to breathe in carbon dioxide. They're going to take in water through their roots. They're going to use sunlight. They're going to make sugar, and then they're going to give off oxygen gas. This process of photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast. That's those little green dots there. You might remember seeing them when we looked at plant cells under the microscope in our cells unit. Just another way of talking about photosynthesis. If you look at that second bullet down there, I think it's an important one to know. Plants are going to use sunlight. They're going to breathe in carbon dioxide. They're going to take up water. The carbohydrate that they're going to make is glucose, and then they're going to give off oxygen gas. Okay? Organisms that photosynthesize are called producers. There are some bacteria out there that also photosynthesize as well. Hey, look, here's a picture of some pretty organisms that photosynthesize. There's some terrestrial plants, there's some aquatic plants, and then there's some bacteria as well. Remember that all life on Earth is dependent on energy from the sun. That energy from the sun is used to make plants. Those plants are eaten by animals, and those animals are also eaten by other animals. So the process of photosynthesis, taking energy from the sun and turning it into glucose, is kind of like the foundation of energy for all life here on Earth. When you look at photosynthesis, it's going to take place in an organelle called a chloroplast. Chloroplasts are going to be green. I think the big players in chloroplasts that you should know are the thylakoids. That's the stack of pancakes that you see there. And you should also know the stroma, and that's the liquid inside of the chloroplast. Plants are going to breathe in and out, just like humans, except they're going to use a structure called the stomata to actually take in carbon dioxide and to breathe out oxygen. Plants are going to use visible light to do this. The reason science teachers always talk about the visible light spectrum, which you see right here, is that if you look at the sun gives off a massive amount of energy in all different forms that actually hits here on Earth. But it's only the energy in the visible light spectrum that plants use for photosynthesis. There's two pigments inside most plant cells that perform photosynthesis. Chlorophyll is the one that's green. Carotenoids are the other pigments that are orange, purple, and yellow. And those carotenoid pigments you would see in the fall when the temperature drops as the chlorophyll degrades inside plants. Visible light spectrum has different wavelengths. The longest wavelength is going to be red. The shortest wavelength is going to be violet. But all those wavelengths of light can be absorbed and used for photosynthesis. There's another look at our photosynthesis chemical equation. That second bullet down I think is kind of important. Sun plus carbon dioxide plus water. We're going to make glucose. We're going to give off oxygen. So when we look at photosynthesis, it's one big overall reaction, but within the chloroplast itself, there's actually three separate reactions that occur that generate, that eventually will generate glucose for the cell. So there is a cluster of enzymes in the chloroplast called photosystem 2. There's another cluster of enzymes called photosystem 1. Photosystem 2 generally comes first. Photosystem 1 will come second. The reason photosystem 1 comes second is because it was the first one that was observed. The part of the photosynthetic cycle that is actually going to make glucose is called the Calvin cycle. So essentially the products from photosystem 2 and photosystem 1 are going to get put into the Calvin cycle, and then the Calvin cycle is going to make glucose. So if we look at this, photosystem 2 is going to be a cluster of enzymes. It's going to be in the chloroplast. And what's going to happen is sunlight is going to penetrate into the chloroplast. It's going to excite electrons in this chloroplast. And then what's going to happen is as these electrons get excited, they're going to pass through a series of electron carriers. And what that's going to do is it's going to end up making a product for us. The hydrogen ions, as the electrons split water, are going to be used to pump through an enzyme called ATP synthase. And then those electrons are going to be used to form a molecule called NADPH. As the electrons get passed down through another cluster of enzymes called photosystem 1, those enzymes then will essentially make NADPH. So as I said in class, the photosystem 2 and photosystem 1, they essentially just make ingredients, almost like we're baking a cake, and those ingredients will get put into the Calvin cycle to make glucose. What is made in photosystem 2? Well, the splitting of water is going to allow hydrogen ions to pass through ATP synthase so that ATP is made, and photosystem 1 is going to pass down a series of electrons down through these electron carriers to make NADPH. Here's the visual of it. In the top left-hand corner, you can see sunlight coming in. It's going to excite electrons that cause water to be split apart. Hydrogen ions go through the enzyme, making enzyme ATP synthase to make ATP. Oxygen is released as a waste product. That's how plants breathe out oxygen. They actually split water, and oxygen then is released as a waste product. As the electrons get carried down, and you can see they get carried down these electron carriers. Once it hits, these electrons hit photosystem 1, they get excited again. And what happens is the energy from the energy state in those electrons is going to be used to make NADPH. So if you look at the bottom right on this diagram, you can see there's two ingredients that are being made, ATP and NADPH. This is another way to look at it. In photosystem 2, the electrons go to a higher energy state, and this cluster of enzymes will make ATP. The enzymes get passed the electrons get passed to another cluster of enzymes called photosystem 1. When sunlight excites them, they go to a higher energy state and produce NADPH. So we can go through all of the steps of the Calvin cycle, but I think it's much easier just to take a broad overview of what the Calvin cycle does. What the Calvin cycle does is it takes ATP, which was made from photosystem 2, it takes NADPH, which was made from photosystem 1, and then the brilliant thing that it does is it takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it uses these molecules to essentially make glucose. So the ingredients from photosystem 2, ATP, the ingredients from photosystem 1, NADPH, plus carbon dioxide, it's going to go through a series of enzymatic reactions inside the stroma of the chloroplast, and eventually those molecules are going to make glucose, and then the plant can use that glucose to make ATP. Simple answer to this question: the Calvin cycle makes glucose. This might be my favorite diagram for photosynthesis for those of you who are confused by it. Photosystem 2, follow it on down, it makes ATP. Photosystem 1 makes NADPH. The Calvin cycle takes carbon dioxide. That's where the carbon comes from for the C6H12O6. It takes these molecules, it moves them through a series of enzymes, and then it makes glucose. The more light that a plant absorbs, the more photosynthesis that occurs up into a point, and then it essentially is photosynthesizing as fast as it can. The more carbon dioxide a plant takes in, the faster the photosynthesis occurs, again up into a point. And most plants are going to function within a specific range of temperatures to photosynthesize most efficiently. So if you think about it, at this point, the plant has now made glucose. Animals, such as humans, don't have to go through this process. So animals essentially eat their glucose. Either way, that glucose has to get made into ATP. And that's what cellular respiration is. Cellular respiration is the process of taking glucose, look down there in the bottom left, combining it with oxygen, and then we're going to release carbon dioxide and water, and in that process we're going to make ATP. Just like photosynthesis, you can see it's one general reaction, but if we go inside the cell, it's actually 4 separate reactions. For those of you who are paying attention, you can see that the reaction for cell respiration is the exact opposite of photosynthesis. So we breathe in oxygen, which was the waste product of photosynthesis. Plants breathe in carbon dioxide, which is the waste product of cell respiration. Here's our 4 different reactions. In the cytoplasm, glycolysis will occur. Then the second reaction will be the transition reaction, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. So again, glycolysis is going to be the only process that occurs outside the mitochondria. Structure of the mitochondria, things that you would need to know. The matrix is the middle of the mitochondria, and the folds are the cristae. Photosynthesis is a redox reaction. That means that glucose is going to be oxidized. It's going to end up losing hydrogens. And the oxygen in cell respiration is going to be reduced. It's going to pick up hydrogens. There's 2 coenzymes that are kind of important in this process. NAD, which is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, and FAD, flavin adenine dinucleotide. These are essentially going to be electron carriers. They're going to carry electrons and hydrogens through the process so that we can use them to pump through an enzyme called ATP synthase, which you might remember from photosynthesis. NAD, once it's used, will then be recycled down, will be used and converted to NADH, and then recycled back into NAD plus again. These are 2 major coenzymes, NAD plus and FADH. These are coenzymes that are used to carry hydrogen ions and electrons through cell respiration. Step 1 is going to be glycolysis. It occurs in the cytoplasm. Glucose is going to get split in half, and when it gets split in half, it's going to make a molecule called pyruvate. We're going to end up getting 2 ATPs out of this process, and we're also going to get 2 NADHs. If it looks like I'm glossing over the chemical reaction, I am. You only need to know the basics as to what goes into glycolysis and what goes out. If you take a cell biology class in college, you can go through the specifics of these reactions. So in glycolysis, glucose gets split in half. Where does this happen? This is going to happen in the cytoplasm of the cell. In the matrix of the mitochondria, we're going to take that pyruvate that we cut in half. We're going to turn that into another molecule called acetyl coenzyme A. This is called the transition reaction. And you can see we cut the pyruvate up, turn it into another carbon compound called acetyl coenzyme A. We're going to give off some carbon dioxide. The important player in this is that we're going to make two NADHs. After that, the citric acid cycle is going to take those acetyl groups. It's going to go through a series of a whole bunch of different chemical reactions, and we're going to make some NADH, some FADH2, and 2 ATPs. For those of you counting at home, so far now we've gone through 3 chemical reactions. In cell respiration, we've made a total of 4 ATPs, 2 from glycolysis, 2 from the citric acid cycle. Okay? Now the important part is this. From that citric acid cycle, which we made some NADH and FADH2, again, this happens in the matrix of the mitochondria, we're going to take the hydrogens from the NADH and from the FADH2, and we're going to pump them through a very special enzyme found in the cristae of the mitochondria called ATP synthase. It's the same enzyme that was found in photosynthesis. Here you can see a visual of this. The hydrogens go through ATP synthase, and as they go through ATP synthase, you can see a whole bunch of ATP is going to be produced. The enzyme that does this, again, is called ATP synthase. This is one view of the hydrogens going through and generating ATP. The numbers of ATPs that are going to be made from the electron transport chain will be 34. And here's the great visual for it. You can see the NADH going through the electron transport chain. We're going to make it so that it's 34 ATPs from the electron transport chain, plus 2 from the citric acid cycle, plus 2 from glycolysis. So the electron transport chain is going to use ATP synthase to make ATP. The total then is going to be 38 total ATPs through the process of cell respiration. Sometimes if there's no oxygen available, your body can still make additional ATPs. The issue with that is that we can take glucose, turn it into pyruvate, and then essentially reduce it to lactic acid. In the process of fermentation, we can make 2 ATPs. The problem is that lactic acid is toxic to cells. You may have had lactic acid buildup in your cells before if you ever felt your muscles burning after you were working out really hard. But fermentation does make some ATPs to allow you to keep going for a little bit. The issue is that lactic acid, if it builds up in your cells, can become toxic. But your body can make some ATP even without oxygen for a little while. So that's the overview of photosynthesis and cell respiration. Hopefully I'm going to see you again on down the line, and we'll talk some science a little more. Thanks.